Welcome back. At this point, our next speaker is the Managing Director in Deloitte's West Coast cybersecurity practice. He builds cybersecurity programs and strategies to safeguard public sector agencies and universities, and has worked extensively with U.S. defense, intelligence, and homeland security, as well as philanthropy and commercial clients. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage Mr. Jesse Goldhammer.
Morning, everyone. I'll give folks a moment to take their seats. Why don't we get started? Let me be probably the fourth or fifth person to welcome you to the Rocky Mountain Cyberspace Symposium. And let me just start and quickly thank Vanessa Johnson, Phil Parker, and all the folks from FCA for giving Deloitte the opportunity to sponsor this conference. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Jesse Goldhammer. I'm a leader in Deloitte's West Coast cybersecurity practice, and I've had the privilege of working in just about every sector, public, private, and philanthropic. Today, my specialization is cyber strategy, but I also have the privilege of running a team of folks out in California who are defending DoD networks. So I get to think about cyber strategy at a very high level, and I get to think about defending endpoints as well. Let me tell you what I want to talk about this morning. A quick agenda. I want to explain why I think the concept of cybersecurity is expanding. I want to talk a little bit about how we should think about the future, and the future of cybersecurity in particular. I have an idea about what I think the official future looks like, and I want to share that with you. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about 4 different trends that I think are shaping the future. I have a wild card that I'm going to introduce, and then finally some lessons for cybersecurity professionals. This picture was taken about 7 decades ago. And in the grand scheme of technical revolutions, 7 decades isn't actually that very long. This is a universal automatic computer, a UNIVAC mainframe. And it became famous in 1951 because they used the UNIVAC to predict the outcome of the 1952 presidential election. The UNIVAC picked Eisenhower. All the pundits picked Adlai Stevenson. The UNIVAC was right. And images like this remind us that cybersecurity, which at least for now I'll define narrowly as protecting digital systems, it changes not just with technology innovation, but also with the ways in which people use that technology. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. So this is a picture of Spot, but this isn't the Spot that I think you guys should meet. And if Spot is ready, maybe we can get Spot to come up front. Spot? Come here, boy. Since we're talking about the future of technology, I want to introduce you to Spot, the robotic dog. Come on up, please. Spot is custom hardware and software. Spot can maneuver in its environment. It can also grab things. Thank you very much. You hang out there for a second. Spot, for those of you who have, by the way, talked to your families about whether or not you've ever seen an edge computer, but you've never really seen one, voila, this is an edge computer. Spot is also a platform. So Spot, at some point in the very near future, is going to be a tool that lots of folks will use to accomplish a myriad of different types of tasks. Now, let me ask you a question for folks who are in the room. How many of you are in the business of securing robots today? Raise your hand. Hard to see with the light, but it doesn't look like very many people. I think in the future, and certainly within the next 10 years, almost all of us are going to be in the business of securing robots like Spot. And by the way, if you're interested in learning more about Spot, I'd encourage you to visit the Deloitte booth outside after this presentation. So Spot, you hang out there for a second, and then we'll get back to you. We are at the very beginning of a profound and massive change. And I'm not talking about just technology, but I'm talking about everything that humans do. Remember, even the phrase cyberspace, which is in the title of this conference, has only been around for 36 years. It was coined by William Gibson in his novel, The Neuromancer, or Neuromancer. And keep in mind, it took something like twice that amount of time between the publishing of the first Gutenberg Bible published, pictured here, and when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Castle Church. After that, we had about 200 years of religious wars, and then a breakaway sect of Puritans left the old world to come to the new world, and that's the reason why we're standing and sitting here today. This matters because it illustrates the power of making knowledge, in this case via printing, widely accessible. It's a tremendous revolution. And the printing press is not the only technological revolution that has changed the human condition. The steam engine, first introduced, at least James Watts's version, in the late 18th century, kicked off the beginning of American global power. Without the Industrial Revolution, we would not have had American global power in the 20th and 21st centuries. But even that didn't come very easily. With the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we had about 24 social revolutions, 2 hot wars, world wars, and a Cold War. My point is that we know that digital technologies are going to change everything, but we don't yet know how. And that's what makes thinking about cybersecurity in 2030 so critically important and also so treacherous. Now, part of the complexity about thinking about cybersecurity 10 years from now is it's not just about the technology, and this is a theme I'm going to come back to again. It's also about a constellation of other types of forces, social, economic, environmental, political, and military, that are shaping the environment in which we work, and are also shaping technology innovation, sometimes propelling it forward, sometimes holding it back. And with all of these changes, technology plus others, we see fundamental shifts in the security landscape and also our security needs. Yeah, of course, we still need to protect Windows systems, and we're still protecting endpoints like mobile phones. But as you folks know better than most, we're also already in the business of protecting ground stations, data links, and satellites. And then there are challenges like this one. So this is an image of a software researcher. His name is Doug Roble, and he created DigiDoug. DigiDoug is a real-time 3D digital rendering of his likeness down to his pores and his wrinkles and even the flow of blood underneath his skin. He uses an inertial motion capture suit, neural networks, and a huge amount of data to recreate himself. You can see Doug's emotions in the recreation of his face. And it reminds us that it is getting increasingly difficult, even today, to make a distinction between what is a real human and what is a fake one, and how to tell the difference between the two. New technologies and new uses for technologies, of course, contribute to our ever-evolving threat landscape. And some of these threats are familiar. Look, we spent most of the 20th century focused on symmetric threats, by which I mean nation states. And when you translate that into the cyber realm, we're talking about advanced persistent threats, and we imagine there's something like 30 of them, and we're talking about malware families produced by these nation states, and we're talking about something like 300 plus distinct families. But especially starting with 9/11, we also have to deal with asymmetric threats. Some of you may remember the 2016 DDoS attack against the company Dyn, which involved using the Mirai botnet, which was essentially a collection of IoT devices like cameras, to send a terabyte of data per second to that company, which has made it hard for many people around the world to actually use the internet. Now, there's still some debate about exactly who perpetrated the attack, but there is an emerging consensus that it was essentially a disgruntled gamer who wanted to take out some of his frustration, shall we say, on the Sony PlayStation Network. Or consider the building pictured just below the word "Dine" on my slide. That is the new headquarters in St. Petersburg, Russia, for Glavset.ru, which is the rebranded Russian Internet Research Agency, with links to Putin and Russian oligarchs, and which, of course, played an important role in the 2016 US presidential election. So look, we all know that DDoS attacks are the equivalent of taking a digital hammer to someone's network. And we all know that information operations have been around for a long time, but have been upgraded with social media, which allows it to be much more effective. Both are great examples of what's possible with new tech and a little ingenuity. That's one of the reasons why I think we keep getting surprised. Because it's really hard for us to imagine how friends and foes are going to use technology in ways that we can't imagine. For those of you who saw the 1983 movie War Games, this phrase, "shall we play a game," reminds us that even the most advanced systems can be hacked, leading to very big surprises, such as when a kid hacks into a supercomputer at NORAD. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, I would encourage you to do so. And almost starts World War III because instead of playing chess, he decides to play a game called thermonuclear war. I would also argue that part of the challenge that we face is really our own. And it's really about our own human limitations. Think about the massive difference between the first Macintosh, which was introduced in the early 1980s, just in terms of compute power. This one, I think, was 128K. And a prototype of a current quantum computer. And then remember that our brains are not evolving at nearly the same rate. We do not have the capacity to understand the immensely complex systems that we are building. We can't even really explain how neural networks learn. From a cybersecurity perspective, we are increasingly the biggest liability in protecting systems, networks, and data. We also fundamentally disagree about what cybersecurity actually means. Is it building a firewall in order to protect systems, networks, and data from outsiders and intruders? That should sound fairly familiar to you folks. Or is it building a great firewall to filter the internet or restrict access to it and to filter content for the sake of social harmony? Look, both are cybersecurity, but they're understood in very different ways. So ultimately, if we're going to talk about the future of cybersecurity, we have to consider what it means. And from my perspective, cybersecurity is the master problem of the 21st century. Because as we consider what it means to secure all digital devices, all connections between those devices, all humans who use and interact with those devices, all data that is generated by those humans, and all the uses to which humans put that data, we are talking about, well, just about everything. It's an immense set of challenges. It's too big to deal with today and now. So let's narrow things down and start with the following question. What if everything we think we know about the future of cybersecurity is wrong? To prepare for the future, we're going to need the right map. Now, when you take a look at this map, which was a reproduction of a map from the 17th century, you may notice something a little funny about it. That is that California is an island. And I know that some of you are thinking, well, hell yeah, California is an island. But in this case, that's not quite what I mean. The reason why you see California as an island here is because in the early 1500s, there was a Spanish novelist who had been reading about explorers going to the New World, and he wrote a romance novel in which he imagined that California was an island, and it was populated by a tribe of Amazonian women. And I promise you, I am not making this up. That novel, which was widely read among people who could read in the 16th century, contributed to 200 years of cartographic errors. People making maps that showed California as an island. That you might think, okay, so what? What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is if you're a missionary or an explorer and you're landing on the west coast of California in the 16th and 17th centuries, and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I go inland? Do I bring my boats or do I not bring my boats? Is there a body of water on the other side of the Sierra Nevada or no? If you don't have the right map, as these folks often learned, you're going to get surprised. And by the way, as a post-it note on that, the error of California being an island was not resolved until the founding of the United States in 1776. So this guy was working on last century's master problem. This is Herman Kahn. He wrote a book called Thinking About the Unthinkable. And he was focused on nuclear war. He used scenario planning, which was a new tool in the middle of the 20th century, to imagine what would happen if we actually fought that nuclear war, and then how can I use the insights from that thinking in order to help us never fight one of those wars. He was one of the architects of 20th century deterrence strategy. And it's important for us because most of the ways in which we still think about cybersecurity are influenced by that mode of thinking, by deterrence. Now, it's important to note that scenario thinking or scenario planning is not about making predictions, and it is also not about forecasting, which typically involves using historical data and projecting it with a particular logic into the future. So take this reproduction of a famous chart from IBM in the early 1980s. IBM was thinking about whether to double down on the personal computer business. They did a forecast. They imagined in the first 5 years of the 1980s that they would sell 240,000 personal computers. And needless to say, no one was impressed, and they decided it probably wasn't worth their time. At the same time, there's a kid at UT Austin in the dorms who had a really interesting idea about how to make it much faster and much easier for people to get PC clones. He founded a company, and in his first year of operations, 1985, Dell Computer, still out of his dorm room, grossed $75 million. It's a good example of two things. First, the past is not a very reliable indicator for thinking about the future. And second, even our current assumptions about what we think the present is like can sometimes lead us to be surprised. So let me give you kind of three very kind of quick ideas about how to think about the future. Number one, it's not about you. It is about a constellation of forces that are external to you and your organization that you have no control over or very little control over. Social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and military. STEAPM for short. Second way to think about it, again, it is not about you. It is about outside-in thinking. It is about understanding how those forces are interacting with each other and shaping your environment, creating your opportunities as well as your challenges and your threats. And then the third is the power of narrative. Because the problem with the future is it's often not very plausible. And so in order to convince people to do something now about a problem that they're going to have 10 years from now, you're going to need a good story. Life is often stranger than fiction. If I had told you back in 2014 that the first major cyber attack against the United States would be conducted by a rogue and hungry nation whose dear leader was upset in an American movie studio for creating a comedy that made fun of him, you would have thought I was insane. And yet, had we at the time been thinking about, for example, what are the economic incentives for corporations to actually defend their networks? Or for American adversaries, if they're not going to go after hard targets like, say, DoD, what kinds of soft targets might they go after in order to make a point? We still would not have predicted Sony, but we probably would have come up with something similar. And by the way, hacked by the GOP is not Grand Old Party. Guardians of the Peace. So, I'm not going to predict the future, but I am going to use some of the tools that I just described to give us a sense of some of these future possibilities. And then, borrowing again from William Gibson, I'm going to imagine that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. I think that's important for thinking about the future, recognizing that it is actually here right now, but it is fragmented. And our job is to figure out how to bring it all together in a way that makes sense. To do that, let's start with the official future. So the official future is a set of assumptions that every organization has about the future. It's essentially a shared story that we tell ourselves about how the future is going to play out. And as you probably can imagine, it's almost always wrong. The reason why you think about the official future is because you want to identify the assumptions that you have that are unlikely to be very helpful to you when you get to the future. Like, for example, the notion that California is an island. A good example of the official future, just in the US government context, is the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends Report. You can look it up online. Every 4 years, they do scenarios for the next 20 years for the entire world. And amazingly enough, most nations on the planet consider it to be sort of the official US official future for the rest of the world. So to give you a sense of what I think the official future is, let me share with you kind of 3 buckets of assumptions, and then I'll tell a story about it. And none of this, I would imagine, is going to be surprising to you. Bucket number 1. It's really hard to be optimistic about cybersecurity over the next 10 years. Hacking is growing and becoming more sophisticated. Defenders have to get it right all the time. Hackers just have to get it right once. Systems, devices, and data proliferating, which makes it just even harder in order to defend those networks. And for us, and even over as we imagine the future, cybersecurity still principally means protecting systems, technologies. So that's the first bucket. We're kind of pessimistic about, I think, what the future looks like. Second bucket, the dream of an open and free internet seems to be withering away. Cyber is not open and free. It's hard to imagine that. Instead, cyber looks increasingly national. And for those of you who are interested in, sort of almost a pamphlet on this topic, check out John Perry Barlow's A Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. He was a lyricist. He is a civil libertarian, member of the, at some point, the Republican as well as Democratic parties, also a lyricist for the Grateful Dead. It is worth taking a look at that just to see what an open and what we imagine that open and free internet to look like and why it looks like it's closing now. We also imagine that cyber has lost its way. It's almost impossible to read articles now about tech companies and not read about how they're not protecting our privacy, they're not protecting our data. In some cases, they're even making it easy for other people to hack us, like, for example, the NSO group in Israel. And cyber, we don't imagine, is going to be just controlled by a handful of states. Instead, we see corporations getting into the mix, mostly outside the United States because of the legal regime we have here, but also non-state actors like ISIS and Hezbollah. And finally, third bucket of assumptions, let's call it only a machine can save us now. The idea that AI is going to take over to defend our systems. For those of you who are going to the RSA conference in San Francisco, coming up quick, count how many times vendors talk about using AI. We imagine that that's going to be important because edge computing is becoming important because we have devices like Spot, which are going to require protection, and it's going to be too hard for humans to do it. And finally, we imagine, well, cybersecurity certainly means job security because there's so many jobs available in cyber until, of course, the AI gets good enough that all those jobs go away because the machines do it for us. So to sum up this future, let me borrow a little trick from Pixar motion pictures just to tell a simple story. So this is what all those assumptions sound like in a story. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful tech revolution. Every day, entrepreneurs developed every kind of application and gadget imaginable. They improved our lives, they connected us, and they freed us from friction. And then one day, we realized that some folks were starting to take advantage of the open and free internet. The hacking and the trolling and the deception started to get really bad, and we started to get scared. Because of that, we started to lock down our data and our systems, keeping it close by and nationalizing it. Because of that, we started to invent ways for computers to protect our data and our systems so that we wouldn't have to, and quite frankly, because we really couldn't. And because of that, cybersecurity professionals seemed like they thought that the business was never going to stop growing until, of course, we learned how to do all of those roles and tasks with computers themselves. Now, that's a future that's not so pretty and maybe not even plausible. So let's explore some alternative future possibilities, and I want to do it by grounding each of these trends in a particular part of the world. I'll explain why in a moment. And let's remember as I go through these trends that it's not just about the technology. It is also about these other constellation of forces, social, economic, environmental, political, and military, that are shaping whether the technology is doing something that is helpful or not. And let's start with data aggregation. Now, the thing about the future is there is always antecedents. And so we've been thinking about data aggregation for a long time. If you go back to the early 2000s, some of you may remember a DARPA program called Total Information Awareness. And total information awareness, the idea was we would essentially gather a massive amount of data from all over the world, and we would use it for counterterrorism purposes. So we would identify people who were going to conduct terrorist activities against the United States. Now, it was probably ahead of its time. Congress was not in love with it. The American people did not love it as well, and it went away pretty quickly. But that does not mean that the government did not continue to use data aggregation tools, and today, as you all know very well, it does so. It also doesn't mean that the private sector didn't latch onto data aggregation tools. Today, data aggregation provides a wide array of benefits in the private sector, everything from solving crimes, catching cheaters in Las Vegas, customizing our online experiences, because you all love it when that pair of boots that you liked continues to follow you around from device to device. Everything from urban planning to even doing basic research about the natural world. So we use this technique in lots of different ways. At my firm, we're hiring data scientists and data engineers like crazy because our clients are all demanding data aggregation services, and in some cases it can be very helpful. For example, we work with clients in the government and in the public and private sector space to put sensors on their networks, and then we capture a huge amount of IP to IP connection data around the world, including metadata associated with those connections, and we give our clients essentially a bird's eye view of what their network looks like from the external internet. Very helpful if you're trying to figure out how to secure your data. So, but in Chengchao, China, data aggregation looks a little bit different. In cities like this one, the Chinese are building a national surveillance system. They already have 200 million cameras dispersed around the country, and they're using AI-powered facial recognition to identify and track each of their 1.4 billion people. The system is coupled with the Chinese social credit system, which is a complex system, but to oversimplify, they use cell phone numbers and online activity, and they associate that with every individual in the country. And then they associate as well a range of different data that was similar to total information awareness, in order to give each person a score. You'll be happy to know that if you contribute philanthropically, that improves your score in China. But if you get a jaywalking ticket, that's apparently not so good. Now, for folks who the Chinese consider to be threats, there's some added features to this system. If you're a Uyghur, for example, some journalists estimate that there's something like 1 million Uyghurs that are now in re-education camps in the eastern part of China. And they also used forced DNA samples because the Chinese are tracking individuals and families and whole ethnicities using DNA. Now, is this system perfect? Absolutely not. Is it applied universally across the country? It is not. Are they as incompetent in applying their programs and their systems as we are? Yeah, pretty much they are. But that doesn't mean that they are not moving in a particular direction. And let me be clear. We in the United States have all the same kinds of data. We have all the same types of technologies. We talk about smart cities. We just mean something very different when we talk about smart cities than the Chinese do. We don't have a social credit system, but we have all the pieces of it. In my opinion, this is a world in which political and economic drivers are moving us in the direction of what lots of folks call algorithmic governance. And algorithmic governance is a simple idea. It's just the notion that we're going to use massive and precise data collection about people to improve governance and make it more effective and make it more efficient. The big question, of course, is what do we mean by improve, and what do they mean by improve? Second one, let's talk about behavioral analytics. We all want to believe that marketing doesn't work. The American marketing industry is about $190 billion a year. It would suggest that someone's getting something for their money. Once upon a time, marketing was kind of quaint. It was really demographic data combined with creative, with ads. And here's an interesting example you can see on the slide here. This is the Marlboro Man. Many of you may not remember that the reason why this was created, it was to get men to smoke filtered cigarettes, because when it was first introduced, mainly women folks smoked filtered cigarettes, and the tobacco industry wanted to expand filtered cigarettes to men as well. It's also interesting that the same targeted advertising techniques were used to curb smoking in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Some have argued, in fact, that that public health campaign, which was targeted at smokers and different demographics of smokers, was one of the most effective in history. But now we've shifted. We've shifted to behavioral analytics and to psychographics, which is using data to understand people's psychology. And these capabilities, too, can be powerful and they can be advantageous. To give you an example, Deloitte works with a lot of different organizations around the world to curb global human trafficking. And it turns out that one way to do that is using behavioral analytics applied to advanced passenger information, which is the data that all airlines send most countries in Western Europe and the United States before passengers arrive. You can use that data, and very large amounts of it, to not only identify people who are doing the trafficking, but people who are also being trafficked. Now, in the future, this might look a little bit different. I would call it, as other folks do, effective computing, which is defined as systems and devices that can recognize, interpret, process, and simulate human emotions. I'm talking about computers that understand your psychology. I am talking about computers that know how you feel. Cambridge Analytica, which used to be based in London, England, is a good example of this. You guys probably remember the story, so I'll be very brief about it. They did a bunch of surveys. They turned those surveys into psychographic profiles of voters. They turned those psychographic profiles of voters into micro-targeted advertising, which they put on social media in order to get people either not to vote or to vote in a particular way, to shape their behavior. They did this in countries outside the United States, and of course, they did this most famously in the 2016 US presidential election. Now, did it work? I actually don't know, and there's quite a bit of debate about whether it worked or not, or whether it was just a bunch of hooey. But for our purposes, it doesn't actually matter. What does matter is thinking about the possibility in 2030 of computers that can understand your emotional states and that can also shape those states. We already have facial recognition today that can understand your emotions. Social media companies today are already using algorithms that can identify folks that post and may have mental illness or suicidal ideation. Here's my point. This is a world in which political and economic and social drivers are going to influence how computers understand our emotions and shape our behaviors. Third trend, data manipulation. The cybersecurity community has long talked about the perils of data manipulation. And there have been a few examples, such as when the Syrian Electronic Army hacked the Associated Press's Twitter account, posted a story about an explosion at the White House which injured then-President Barack Obama. The story was fake, but the plunge in the Dow Jones was quite real. In the last few years, data manipulation has become more serious. Now we make distinctions between mis and disinformation, deep fakes, fake audio. We're even entering into the domain of adversarial machine learning. The problem for us as we head into 2030 is that it's getting harder for us and frankly harder for the computers as well to tell the difference between fact and fiction. And let's face it, the folks who are schooling us right now on these issues are the Russians with their asymmetric information operations. And here's the beauty of I/O. It doesn't really matter whether the image or the sound or the story is fake or real. And it doesn't even matter whether we have the technical ability to determine whether it's fake or real. All that matters is that people believe it. For the computers, the problem is a little bit different. We've already seen examples of spoofing. For example, showing engineers with industrial control systems information about the system that isn't actually true. But what happens when adversaries corrupt third-party data that's used for military intelligence purposes, like weather data or other types of images? Or even worse, what happens when they subtly corrupt the data sets that we use to train our algorithms? Like in the picture you see on my slide here, you can't see the difference between the panda on the right and the panda on the left. But with adversarial machine learning, you can change a few pixels on that panda, and if you insert that into a training data set, you will cause the algorithm to misclassify the image. It may not sound like a big deal, but if we're moving toward, as I'll say in a moment, artificial intelligence and autonomous systems, it's a really big deal. So what I'm calling, let's call it data operations, diminishes trust in our digital systems, just as information operations diminishes trust in our political systems. And so we're talking about a world in which political and military drivers are influencing how human trust in our institutions becomes linked to those institutions' capacity to manage data integrity. We're talking about an erosion of trust. It's pretty critical for all of us. Last trend, artificial intelligence. Now, in some ways, this is the most interesting because it combines elements of all the previous three. We're entering into a world in which computers can accomplish increasingly sophisticated tasks using massive amounts of data, repetition, and judgment. Today, we talk about this in terms of intelligent automation. And this is a field in which firms like mine are aggressively trying to lead. For example, we have a client, a large logistics company, and interested in reducing the cost of repairing vehicles, and so we're helping them to install sensors in those vehicles to process the data that comes off those sensors so that they can do predictive maintenance. A great example of taking something that would otherwise be very cumbersome and expensive and making it very efficient. Intelligent automation is not new. It's just the first step in combining robotics and AI in the direction that we're now talking. So in the future, we're going to see whole systems become increasingly autonomous, and we're going to be faced with some brutal ethical questions. I picked Bedford, Massachusetts as the location for this particular trend because that is the home of iRobot, which is the manufacturer of the Roomba robotic vacuum cleaner, as well as some of the first military bots, for example, called PackBots. And I sort of like the idea that 50 years from now, when we're explaining to kids like how autonomous systems came into being, that we're going to have to say that it all started with the vacuum cleaner. Now, as many of you, I'm sure, already know, the early adopters of autonomous systems are already the military, for example, using robots, autonomous transportation systems like the ship you see there, which is called Active. It's a DARPA program. That ship hunts enemy submarines, and it recently made a voyage from San Diego to Hawaii without a crew. Of course, the Air Force is also in this game and experimenting with drone swarms using Perdix drones. In the consumer space, you also see a move toward autonomous systems. Autonomous transportation systems, of course, smart cities, as well as completely changing the consumer experience. Think of like delivery centers that are essentially just have robots and then drone delivery of your Amazon packages. The impact of autonomous systems is going to be profound. And when I say profound, I mean profound like the printing press profound. I mean profound like the steam engine profound. It's going to impact how we work, how we move, how we consume, how we educate, how we govern. And for you folks, it's going to have a huge impact on how we fight. And as we implement these autonomous systems, we're going to encounter a whole new breed of cybersecurity challenges. Because it's not just about protecting the systems themselves, it's also about how we protect humans from those systems. And frankly, I think the driver of this is not going to be our own ethical choices. I think this is going to be the AI version of keeping up with the Joneses. Because as our adversaries make choices that we currently do not want to make, we are going to be in the very uncomfortable position of having to match them. With those trends in mind, let me introduce one wild card. A wild card is a low probability, high impact, unpredictable event. A good example from the 20th century would be this: nuclear weapons. Before World War II, no one could have predicted who would get the bomb first or when or how they would use it. The fact that we got it first and we used it to end the war shaped the second half of the 20th century and arguably continues to shape not only our foreign relations, but also shapes, to a very large extent, how we think about cybersecurity. In the 21st century, as we've already talked about this morning a little bit, the clear winner for wild cards would be quantum computing. Now, I'm not going to try to explain quantum computing to you folks, but there are lots of signs that quantum is coming. One of the gentlemen from the previous panel mentioned it, but let me put it in context. Google recently announced that its 54-qubit Sycamore processor was able to perform a calculation in 200 seconds that would have taken the fastest conventional computer on the planet 10,000 years. That is monumental. It raises two fundamental questions for us. The first is, whoever gets a functional quantum computer first is going to be able to do magical things like decrypt all traditionally encrypted data. The second one is maybe a little bit more interesting for our purposes today, which is it's almost a geopolitical question. How would we know if someone else got a quantum computer first and we're secretly using it? What would we see? What would be those indicators? So let me now offer you just a couple of conclusions, and then if there's time, I'll take questions. During the next 10 years, many of the driving forces that we've discussed are going to be pushing technology to become more ubiquitous, complex, and data-driven. For cybersecurity professionals, that means a crazy juggling act, because we're going to have to manage all kinds of old legacy systems, Windows XP, while at the same time having to secure advanced systems. And we're going to have to do that at the same time. It's almost certain that cybersecurity is going to become increasingly algorithmic and automated. And that also means that the threats that we have to prevent are also going to become increasingly algorithmic and automated. And by the way, that creates a cycle of strategic interdependence. It's a game. And we're going to be playing that game just like we played the missile gap game in the 20th century. The biggest risk that we face in the next 10 years is sitting in front of the tables right here, right now. It's us, it is people, it is our own cognitive limitations as we build these immensely complicated systems. And I think we could safely say that probably the next big wave of startups are going to be data integrity startups. Because if we're going to be if we need systems that are increasingly autonomous and increasingly algorithmic, we are going to have to protect the data very, very carefully. As data aggregation and behavioral analytics and AI converge, the folks who do cybersecurity are going to have to spend a lot of time protecting the crown jewels. And the crown jewels are going to be data sets that have integrity and the algorithms that are able to either train on those data sets or able to analyze those data sets. In our part of the world, the concept of cybersecurity is going to expand to include the protection of people's rights from these systems. That is going to put more pressure, I think, on data nationalization and internet balkanization, because we are all going to get a little skittish about having our data sitting on servers in other people's countries with other people's algorithms, doing things with it that reflect values that we may not like very much. And finally, a bit of good news. I think that especially with advances in behavioral analytics, it's going to be much harder for insider threats to do what they do, because if they're using a computer system and that computer system can understand your emotions and how you feel, it's going to be a little bit like, typing into a polygraph. I think it's going to be very hard for them to compromise our systems. So like it or not, we're moving in the direction of fully autonomous systems by 2030. And for us, I think that means that we will be in the business of protecting increasingly complex systems, not only from the imperfections of their creators, but also from the imperfections of their users. I also think that the concept of cybersecurity is going to expand, putting us in the position not just of protecting humans from computers, But more specifically, sorry, let me reverse that, putting us in the position of protecting humans from computers, and specifically from autonomous systems that may do things that we either don't like or we don't want. As I said, I think cybersecurity is the master problem of the 21st century, and thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I think the next 10 years might look like. And I've got a minute. Questions or?
I think we have to move to lunch.
So I think you folks are off to lunch.
Sir, on behalf of the chapter, I want to thank you for, and of course Spot, for being here today, for spending your time with us and offering your excellent insights.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. And Spot, why don't you come with me?
Okay, folks, at this point, it is, as Mr. Goldhammer said, just about lunchtime. If you've signed up for our lunch today, please ask you to begin to move over to the International Hall. If you haven't been here before, that's out the front door to your left. And kindly sponsored, our luncheon is sponsored by Palo Alto Networks, and our luncheon keynote speaker, Major General Retired John Davis, Vice President and Federal Chief Security Officer of Palo Alto Networks. So hope to see you next door at 12:15. Thank you.